The new sermon series is Engaged. Thomas mentioned last Sunday when he preached that he was wrapping up the Called sermon series, and we are now transitioning into Engaged. And it reminds me a lot of our February, March, April sermon series, where in February the sermons were on faith. In March, they were on action, and in February, they were on love. And the idea there was that, love, hey Daniel, love will give your action value. And you saw that in Corinthians, where Paul says, all your actions are meaningless if you don't have love. And then, of course, your action is evidence of your faith, so that was a nice continual thought there. And now we have Engaged following the sermon series Called. And I feel like there's a similar trend there between Called and Engaged as there was between faith and action. Having a calling without being engaged is like an unfinished sentence. It's a joke. It's like an unfinished sentence. Being called and not being engaged is like an unfinished sentence. It's a joke. It's a joke. Okay, great. So first, I think it's nice to understand what engaged is. What's that mean? As you know, because I say a lot of it, I say it a lot when I'm here, I'm a scientist and I like definitions. And, we have a definition for a meter and a kilogram and a second, and we have all these definitions. So I was looking at, what's a great definition for engaged? And being engaged is fully applying your full self for a purpose. That sounds a lot like giving it your all, being fully committed. Engagement will convert potential into an outcome. I used to watch Star Trek with my dad a lot, and I always remember Captain Picard. He would say, "Make it so," or he would say, "Geordi, set the thrusters to warp speed," and then he would say, "Engage." So we have all this potential. Engagement lets us have an outcome with that potential. There are several ways to be engaged. Very broadly speaking, I think there are three ways to be engaged in the scope of Christianity. That is being engaged with God, being engaged with our own selves, and being engaged with others. Sometimes being engaged with yourself and being engaged with others can be very challenging. It can seem negative. It can seem negative. It can have a very negative perspective. So today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about engaging with others, engaging with your environment. In fact, the topic of today's sermon is regarding the story of David and Goliath, because David engaged Goliath. I listened to a lot of sermons online about David and Goliath, to get a feel for what's out there and some good ideas, and I'll share a highlight and I'll share a lowlight. So one of the highlights was that the story of David and Goliath is not one of you being able to defeat your biggest challenge on your own. It's primarily a story about how God fights our unwinnable battles. That's the battle against sin. God fights that unwinnable battle on our behalf. David and Goliath, on the big scope, is a picture of how, from a place no one expected, came a humble individual and rescued a people from death and slavery. Because that was the outcome. We'll hear a little more. But that was the outcome of David and Goliath. The battle was, you will be my servant, we will be your servants, or you will be our servants. And so I think that's a great thing to think about. That's not the topic of today's sermon, but think about it. A few of the lowlights. I heard a couple sermons where people took half of the time and talked about, how tall Goliath was. And I learned in that process that there's a couple definitions of a cubit. There's like a Roman cubit and a royal cubit, and there's a range of heights that he could have been. But under any circumstances, this story is actually captured by a secular historian, Josephus. And Josephus also said he was a big guy. So let's just say Goliath was a big guy. I'm not going to worry about how much his armor weighed or how much his javelin weighed. I thought, do I really add value by spending too much time trying to convert those units to relevant units today? I don't add a lot of value, especially considering this. Now, this is a little nuanced, but it doesn't really matter how tall Goliath was, because unless you know the average height of everyone else, it could be irrelevant. If he's 9 feet and everybody else is 8'5", or he could be 6 feet and everybody else 4. Nonetheless, it doesn't matter. We'll just suffice with Goliath was a big guy. He was bigger than the average guy. He was a scary guy. He threatened peace, and he was a symbol of the Philistine army. So, just a few comments before we get into the scripture. Engagement, and you'll see it here in this scripture, engagement can often be scary. It can be risky. I think that's the story of David and Goliath. And, we engage in many ways in our life, in many areas in our life, and it doesn't always involve war. But this is a story about how David engaged in a challenge, and God came through for him. And there's a few really important areas where David engaged. I'm going to highlight those. So, go back one slide. In verses 1 through 3, the Philistines gathered their forces for war. That sets the tone, right? This is not a good interaction. This is not a good thing that's happening for anybody. The armies of Saul are there, and the Philistines are there, and a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp, and he was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He had bronze armor. He had bronze leg protection. He had a bronze javelin. And he had a big spear. And if you think about this, and this caught my attention here, the fact that bronze is mentioned 4 times. Turns out, you can find this out just through simply Googling it, but that the Philistines were some of the early adopters of bronze. That was a technologically advanced material for the time. So they had an advantage. If you're in a war and people have slings and bows and arrows and the other people have bronze, big difference. Goliath was a champion. He had been there and he had done that. This was a scary guy, and we know that. You can go to the next slide. We know that because Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" It's like, why are you here? I'm a Philistine. You guys are servants of Saul. Why aren't we doing this? Let's go. Why are you even here? You're not going to fight me. And so he poses this. Send somebody to fight me. And if he, essentially I'll paraphrase, if he can kill me, we'll be your subjects. But if I can kill him, you will be our subjects. And the Philistine said, this day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. I put that there twice. Think about that. They were dismayed and terrified upon hearing those words. This challenge caused fear. Goliath was even going at David psychologically. Imagine the stress. Imagine knowing what's at stake in this battle. Imagine knowing that if you are not victorious, you're dead and all your family's a slave. Imagine that. The stress, the pressure. So now the story sort of takes a turn and sort of fills in a little bit on the backstory about David being with his father and his father gathering bread and cheese to take to his brothers who were in Saul's army. And David gets there and finds the army and finds his brothers, and he hears the situation in verse 23. As he was talking with them, his brothers, as David was talking with his brothers, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. David asks, what is going on, and what will be done for the person who can defeat Goliath? So the first point about engagement is that engagement does not happen by accident. Engagement doesn't happen by accident. David, he wasn't there to figure out what's going on with Goliath. He wasn't there to figure out what's the plan for the reward for the guy who can take out Goliath. He was there to deliver some bread and cheese to his brothers. But there was something that stirred in him that said, I'm going to check this out a little further. So David was engaged with this situation on purpose. He engaged himself with it. If you feel like you're called for something, you might have to take that uncomfortable step where you engage yourself on purpose with the thing. By the way, his efforts to be engaged were not very welcomed. His oldest brother heard him speaking with the men and burned with anger at him and said, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness?" Listen to this. This is terrible. "I know how conceited you are, how wicked your heart is. You came down here only to watch the battle." Wow. Can you imagine getting that kind of support and love from your family? So he shows up to bring his brothers food. He wants to know what's going on. He's starting to get engaged. Totally not welcome. Totally not welcome. You know, when you choose to engage, sometimes you're not going to feel acceptance. You're not going to feel welcome. When you choose to engage, you may suffer rejection. But what did David do? He actually turned away and went to somebody else and brought up the same matter. And those guys answered him as before. But somebody overheard that and told Saul. So here's David. Really, he's not, I wouldn't say, definitely he's not qualified for this, right? He's a shepherd. He's young. He shows up for one reason. He kind of noses in to another reason, to another area. He wants to know what's going on with Goliath. And that is, the door is just slammed shut on that idea. So David, as I mentioned in the previous slide, Saul heard about this. So David and Saul are now in a conversation. And David says, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." Okay, if you're a warrior from your youth, that's like being a hockey player with your teeth. It says a lot if you're a hockey player and you have teeth. That's that you're a good hockey player if you have your teeth. If you've been a warrior for a long time and you're a big guy and you've got bronze all over you and you're still alive and this is your thing, you're a champion, this is a skilled man. He's a killing machine, Goliath. And Saul says that, "You're not ready for this." And then David remembers a few things. And, sometimes in our lives, we are exposed to situations that we don't like. We get through them. Those are meant to be, my sister's giving me a signal here. Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's the only time she brings me water. Since I'm the youngest, I have to bring her water, but advantage of being up here, she has to, respect me a little bit. Nope. So, I didn't hear. What did you say, Jean? Oh, yes, yeah. So David now is telling Saul about the times when the sheep that he cared for were attacked by a bear and a lion, and how he defended his sheep. And he says, "I can do the same thing to Goliath as I did to the sheep and to the bear." David reflected on his previous experiences. Again, now, David is risking a lot to be engaged. I recall when Renee was preaching in March on action, and she said, if we act like Jesus, we will be misunderstood by other churches. If you engage in certain areas, in certain ways, with certain people, it can be bad news for you. There's a cancel culture out there. There can be a cancel culture sometimes in here. But, when we engage with people around us the way that God's called us to, there could be some risk associated with that. Reputation risk, prestige risk. There's risk associated with acting on your calling and engaging with those around you. So, David is reflecting on his previous experiences, the times that God delivered a victory to him. And I have a few stories that throughout my life, I've remembered the story of David and Goliath. One time I was about 19, and, when I went to college, I wasn't ready for college. I went to college. I didn't realize, how dorms worked. I thought students who lived in dorms had bought them or their rich parents had bought them. So I got a camper, and I went to a campground, and I lived in a camper for 3 years as an undergraduate. And one thing I did was, from 16 to 18, I ran a Christmas tree lot in Charlotte. My dad used to grow Christmas trees. And a guy came along, Michael Dotson from TNT Fireworks, and he said, you're an entrepreneur. How about you sell some fireworks? So I started doing that when I was 18. And then I was about 19. I was in Winston-Salem. I spent like 14 days in a Walmart parking lot. I slept there. I stayed there all day. It's the glories of fireworks. And somebody pulled up to my tent and grabbed my generator and threw it in their car and drove off. Now, you know, a $300 or $400 generator was a big deal. And I left the tent, all the fireworks there, which I was responsible for, and I started pursuing this guy who stole my generator. And I lost him, and I prayed, God, I need that generator. And so I pulled into this old, you know, like this seedy hotel area, and I just knew, I was like, this is where the guy lives. And so I parked my car, and I blocked the entrance to there, and I started going around, and I had a stick, because I was 19. I was like, this will take care of every problem. I had a stick, and I saw the guy who stole my generator, and I saw his car, and then I saw him and his buddy and his other buddy and his other buddy. So I left my car there, and I ran away, and I called the police, and I got my generator back. And that's a story that I've reflected on in my life a couple times. Like, you know, I had this, you know, it might be meaningless to you, and it's certainly meaningless now. I mean, I would never do that again. I would just get a new generator, call the police, and I'd get a new generator, and I wouldn't go with a stick and face who knows who for a generator. But it was really important to me at the time. And I recall, like, just reflecting on the fact that I felt like David in that moment. Now, there's another time that I've felt like David, and that is, you know, when I went to California for a job, and you know, I left my wife and kids here to stay with my parents, and I went to California, and I was going to, like, find a house quickly, and we were going to buy it. And in California, nobody wants to sell their house. And so my realtor was knocking on doors, and finally somebody was interested in selling their house, and they said, you know, it's 1,000 square feet. What do you think, like $1 million? Okay, so, you know, that's how life is in California. So, you know, I was like refocusing, regrouping, thinking about what to do, and I really just wanted to do great at my new job. So I've never said this publicly, so if anybody from my work hears this. So we had this building on the downtown in the financial district in San Francisco, and there was a lactation closet that nobody used, because nobody was a lactating mother. And so that's where I lived. I would work 2 days a day. So I would get up about 5 because the cleaning people would come, and they couldn't see me there. And so I would be at my desk like by 6 a.m., and I would work, and then I would leave like from 4 to 5 and like take a walk downtown, which was fun, and then I'd be back at my office, and I would work until the last cleaning person left at like 11. And there was a kitchen, and they had food, and so, you know, I lived like a billionaire, because who else can afford the 17th floor of downtown San Francisco? It was great. I mean, I loved it. But I just really, and I often recall thinking back about that this is my bear. Like, I'm David, and this is my bear, and I'm going to kill it. And I'm going to make this work, and this is going to be successful, and I'm going to be successful. And I just really felt, you know, engaged there. And believe it or not, I often in that situation would think back to the story of David and Goliath. Like, I can accomplish this crazy hard thing, and I can stick to it, and I can accomplish it, and I can be victorious, and I can fight it, and I can go through this. And for me, in those situations in my life, I have reflected quite a bit back on the story of David and Goliath. And in times between the time my generator got stolen and I was, you know, I was working 14 days, sleeping in a Walmart parking lot for like $2,000. And it's when you work 24 hours a day for 2 weeks, you get tired, believe me. It's not how you want to spend your summer vacation, but when you're a college student, you know, sometimes that's how you do it. You know, and in between then and in between this situation, you know, where I worked for Jewel, and I was working really hard, and I'd just gone to San Francisco. And, you know, it's amazing how the Lord worked that out, because of all places, how did I wind up in Statesville? I moved to California to get to Statesville, and I've been here, you know, almost coming on 2 years, so it's looking like it's not just 2 weeks in my parents' house like it was when I got here in March last year. So it's, you know, it's just amazing how God turned that situation around for me. And, I didn't see how it would work out. And it was a risk. Anyways, this part of my life really resonates with me to this scripture. And that's why I'm sharing it. Nothing's risk-free. Marriage isn't risk-free. A car is not risk-free. When you engage in what you feel called to do, it's not going to be risk-free. But there's the fact that God can come through for you. And if you're acting in your calling, God will come through for you. So 36 through 49, we know the story. David fights and defeats Goliath. And here's another reference to the fact that David fought and didn't have a sword. So I think there's real legitimacy to the fact that the Philistines were more advanced with their ability to have iron. And then you think about, why was it that only Saul had armor that he could offer David? You know that part of the story? Where Saul says, take my armor, and David's like, it doesn't fit. And Saul's like, okay. I mean, it seems like if there was just armor everywhere, he would have said, well, let's get a different size. Let's try on a different size. It's almost like there was one set of armor in the Israelite army, and Saul had it. Potentially. So, these Philistines, they had an advantage. But this is true. Look at verse 52. After David defeated Goliath, the other men surged forward with a shout. They all became warriors all of a sudden, didn't they? The very guys who were telling David, you have evil in your heart. Why are you here? You just want to see the bloodshed. Those very same guys, after Goliath was dead, surged. They would have taken a picture like this, with their sword or with their sling or with their bow. Look at what I did. Look what I was a part of. So, when you're engaged and you're acting in your calling, you're going to face rejection and discouragement, sometimes from even your big brothers, like David did. But God will come through for you. And that's what I was saying earlier when I came up and I just was absorbing the service. And it came to me that, you engage through faith. And if there's any trend line that's in this church over 30 years, it's faith. It really is. How things come together and how people step out in faith and accomplish things that, Renee was talking about the fact that she wasn't sure how to do this or that. She's mentioned that a couple times. Dad, when he started in ministry. And then there's lots of examples in everyone's lives where you start with faith and God comes through. And then, like the story of David and Goliath, and then everybody else will come through like, I knew you could do it. I was behind you the whole time. They surge. And so in closing, there's a few points that I think are gatherable from this story and this scripture. And that is, when you are engaged, or how to engage, or engagement involves recognizing a need that you can meet or you can help meet. I mean, that's a great example between Leah Beth and Ashley today, where that's engagement. That wasn't planned for this Sunday, by the way. And David rehearsed, he recalled what God had done for him. David thought bigger than his challenge. He was not discouraged when people rejected him and told him his heart was evil for his Can you imagine? He's there. He sees this Philistine defiling the army. And he's like, what's going on? And they're like, you have an evil heart. Wow, that's terrible. His own brother, his big brother. He wasn't discouraged, and he wasn't afraid. He remembered what God had done for him in the past. So I encourage you, trust that God will come through for you as you engage in your calling. And then lastly, think about this. You're here, so engage here. Have an impact here. Take a risk here.